Order. I will call Wendy Chamberlain to move the motion, and I'll then call the Minister to respond. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as is the convention in 30-minute debates. Order. Order. Wendy Chamberlain to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the conduct of elections, and it's a privilege to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Mundell. We are approaching the general election at some point this year, or maybe next. And a lot has happened since the last one in December 2019. And the other thing to note is it isn't a snap general election that we are looking forward to as well. The country has experienced a number of events since December 2019, but I think it's important to note, and that's the intention of my debate here this morning, there have been a number of changes to the operation of our democracy that will be fully tested for the first time in a general election since 2019. And I think it's worthwhile assessing whether those have improved our democratic systems or whether there's a concern that they are have been a tool for the current government to improve its own position. If we look first at the Conservatives' manifesto in 2019, the government committed to a number of changes, including the scrapping of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, updating and equalising boundaries through the Constituencies Act, maintaining first past the post, and perhaps this is the opportunity for me to wonder whether the former Vice-Chair of the Conservatives and now Reform MP Lee Anderson agrees with that, given that he is now a member of a party committed to electoral reform that has signed up to the Make Votes Matter Good Systems Agreement. It's always worth noting at this point that first past the post, the only other country in Europe that has the same system is Belarus. The government also committed to maintaining the voting age of 18, to introducing voter ID, restricting postal vote harvesting and foreign interference in elections. It's a pity they've been slower to move on this issue than when it comes to party finances. And also preventing intimidation of candidates and voters was something the government committed to do, and I'm sure we would all be in agreement to that. It also committed to introducing a Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission within the first year of the new Parliament. And in December 2020, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee held oral evidence sessions on the Commission, but other than independent reviews of administrative law and the Human Rights Act, the reports of which have now resulted in further consultations, there is no Commission. Indeed, the Constitution Unit has suggested that the government's failure on this manifesto commitment is because the underlying goal is to bolster its position and weaken parliamentary and judicial checks, and that a more fragmented review process may help to obscure the combined effort of any reforms and to divide opponents. I hope the Minister will be able to provide clarity on the future of the Commission, whether it will indeed come into being before the election, in his remarks. As an MP, when someone comes to me for assistance, and I'm sure this is the case for all honourable and right honourable members here, the first thing we do is that we check that they are indeed my constituent. And we do that by finding out where they live, Mr Mundell. Indeed, I'm sure the vast majority of MPs on the standard automated acknowledgement email that they send out point out to the person who has emailed that they must be a constituent in order to get assistance. But it's important to note, Mr Mundell, that constituencies themselves are not organised on this basis, but instead on the number of registered voters within them. And the Constituencies Act passed during this Parliament set a tolerance of 5% quota to produce what the government insists are equal constituencies to ensure that each vote applies equally. Now, this has resulted in huge differences in the constituencies to be fought in the upcoming general election. Indeed, only 55 of the 533 English constituencies remain unchanged by boundaries. The geographical boundaries have shifted, and names of some of the new constituencies are a mouthful, linking areas that are not necessarily linked in other obvious definable ways. Happy to give way to the Honourable Member for Strangford.
I commend the Honourable Lady for North East Fife for bringing this forward. The Honourable Lady brings many things to Westminster Hall, many things to the Chamber, which are of great interest to us all. So I thank the Honourable Lady for giving me the chance to intervene. The changes in the Act apply to the United Kingdom Parliament elections, Police and Crime Commissioner elections in England and Wales, local elections in England. Some provisions will apply to Northern Ireland Assembly elections and local elections as well. Does the Honourable Lady agree that all provisions within this Act should apply to all elections within all regions of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
I'm grateful to Honourable Member for Strangford. He always brings an additional dimension to these debates. I think what's important from a democratic perspective is that where devolution exists, it's respected. And I think the fact that in relation to the Elections Act 2022, the fact that the Welsh and Scottish governments did not provide legislative consent and are looking to legislate themselves is important and should be recognised. I would like to see a consistency across our electoral systems in the UK, but I also think that as a Scottish MP, I do always enjoy speaking to voters regardless of the election, and also understanding how clever and able they are, and they know exactly what to do with the different electoral systems that we have for the different institutions. I just want to touch on at this point, Mr Mundell, the impact of overseas voters. Now, that has come into being. It means that people who are UK nationals who live overseas are no longer impacted by the fact that if they live overseas for more than 15 years, they will no longer be able to vote. But one of the challenges of the overseas voters' changes is the fact that we do not know where these overseas voters are likely to vote. Local authorities don't keep electoral registers that go back more than 15 years in many cases, and we are basing those estimates on where people lived previously and assuring that they lived previously. But I would argue that given that we've set a tolerance of 5% to make each vote count equally in equally sized constituencies, we are introducing an unknown number to a number of constituencies. And I'd be grateful if the Minister could perhaps talk about what the Government has done in that respect to ensure that people are being registered in the right place when they're overseas, but also what the estimates of the numbers of people that are being registered is. The Minister will also be pleased to know that this won't be the point when I go on to talk about first past the post at length as a Liberal Democrat. It's something I always do, but it is worth pointing out that trust in politics is at an all-time low. A system that is arguably unable to deliver fair votes where everyone's vote does count is unlikely to improve that situation. In my own constituency, only 2 votes separated the Liberal Democrats and the SNP in the 2017 general election. I should add at this point I was not the candidate for the Liberal Democrats then. But this does mean that many more constituents voted for someone other than the winner. And this is what marginal seats actually mean. And I think it's important that we recognise that. Unlocked Democracy's recent report, Register Every Voter, illustrates some of the challenges that the Government's approach has produced in terms of whether electoral registers do indeed support our democracy. And I'm quoting from the report here, which has evaluated registers on the basis of register completeness, which is the completeness of the electoral register, the extent to which every person who's entitled to be registered is registered. Its accuracy can be usefully defined as the extent to which there are no false entries on the electoral registers. Register equity. Degree of equity in electoral registers refers to the extent to which there is an even distribution in the completeness of the electoral register across educational, socio-demographic, ethnic, gendered and other groups. And administrative robustness, where electoral registration processes must be deliverable without errors which can lead to citizens not being able to vote or the trust in the system being undermined. And this requires sufficient staffing, resource and capacity. Now, this report estimates that up to 8 million people are missing from the electoral register or not correctly registered to vote. And it's unsurprising, Mr Mundell, that those under-registered are more likely to be in urban areas, to be more mobile, private renters, younger, from Asian, black, mixed or other ethnic backgrounds, non-UK nationals and from lower social economic groups and with lower qualifications. I would argue that these are exactly the people who need good politics and good support from locally elected representatives. And even more concerningly, Mr Mundell, the actual number of people registering to vote is falling. That should concern us all as MPs. An increase in the UK population of 6% since 2011 has not been reflected in voter registration. Now, I accept that registration usually increases at the time of a general election, and we've actually not had one of those for a while, but the overall trend is worrying. And I hope the Minister can give an indication of what the Government is intending to do about this, and whether looking at something such as automatic voter registration, which is used by half of the world countries, is something that should more seriously be considered. But it's also true that voter ID requirements are also potentially playing their part. In an urgent question in the Chamber last September, I highlighted the Electoral Commission's report that warned that disabled people and the unemployed found it harder to show accepted voter ID, as well as younger people and people from ethnic minorities. It also reported that on average more deprived areas had a higher proportion turned away compared with less deprived areas. The Local Government Information Unit reported that approximately 14,000 voters were not given a ballot paper because they could not show an accepted form of ID, and significantly more were deterred from voting because of the ID requirement. Happy to give way.
That's generous, and thank you for that. I just want to say, Mr Chairman, that in Northern Ireland we've had a voter ID for a number of years. It's not a criticism, I'm trying to be positive in my intervention, but it has been successful. I think it's a matter of what government can do to help people get their IDs, and I know there's a very proactive campaign in Northern Ireland to make that happen, and I would say genuinely, constructively and honestly that the voter ID in Northern Ireland has worked because government has went overboard to make it work.
I'm grateful to Honourable Member for Strangford. We rarely disagree, and I think there are points of consensus that we can find on this. I think one of the things that Northern Ireland has done very well is it's much more proactive in getting people registered to vote, working in schools and elsewhere, which means that in some respects the voter ID is less of an issue because people have been encouraged to vote and to have the right ID at an early stage. I think it's a case of having one and not the other makes things much more difficult for people, and lends to the given the people that don't have voter ID or don't have acceptable voter ID, it does create this idea that potentially that is something that the government is comfortable with, that those people are not in a position to be able to vote. If I can just finish the quote from the Electoral Commission's report. The Commons Library briefing on voter ID states that 90% of voters were likely to think the voting was safe after last year's local elections in England. But this pattern was actually unchanged since before voter ID was introduced. So introducing voter ID has made no difference to public perception on the safety of voting. And the Government response to the Electoral Commission report in November of last year did reject a number of the Commission's recommendations that arose from that report. So I'd be grateful if the Minister, given that he was responsible for that response, advised what additional measures will be available for the GE, particularly for groups such as disabled people, to ensure that those who are entitled to vote can. Now, I've already mentioned the Elections Act 2022 in response to the Honourable Member for Strangford, and it did include measures to address the impact of candidate and voter intimidation, and I'm sure that that is something that we would all want to see less of, particularly when MP security and safety has been back in the public eye and discussion in recent weeks. But it's fair to say that these elements of the Elections Act did not constitute the areas of the bill when it made its passage. In addition to voter ID, the concerns expressed by other parties, including my own, were in relation to finance and the independence of the Electoral Commission. It's accepted, Mr Mundell, that the next election will be the most expensive ever, and that's not just because of recent high inflation levels. And we do know who that will disproportionately benefit. It will benefit the current party of government, the Conservatives. And again, the Electoral Commission said in November that it saw no reason to substantially raise the spending limits. We are seeing reporting on huge increases in literature that is being delivered. As a Liberal Democrat, obviously, I deliver a lot of leaflets, but also in terms of social media. And when we are looking at things such as disinformation, it's really important that we get these things right. And the data rules that are changing too are part of the challenge. Simply put, these changes reward the biggest pockets. Social media and other means of communicating with voters are important, but I genuinely believe that being out in the doors, speaking to voters, is the most effective, particularly from that trust perspective. In the last couple of weeks, there's been quite a lot of discussion about the current government's donations, and particularly their donor, Frank Hester. Now, I understand that the government have obviously said that the comments were wrong and that they were racist, but has not ruled out accepting future donations, and more importantly, and also very much importantly, has not ruled out granting a peerage to Mr Hester, particularly given that that is something that seems to happen quite a lot with Conservative donors. I would hope that the Minister could find his way to doing that. I think it would provide a lot of reassurance. But will the Minister just generally agree that big money is potentially a further drain on public trust in politics, and that a cap on political donations would help that? And it would also level the playing field. Myself, parliamentarians from smaller parties like the SNP or Plaid Cymru would benefit, and that's not a bad thing, I would argue, because that plurality of opinion is important, because what we've created is a system that two parties are in the lead and nothing changes. To conclude, Mr Mundell, I think what is quite clear is that there have been a number of changes since 2019, and we will see at the general election whether the fears that I've expressed this morning are going to be held out, or whether the Conservatives have made changes that do not have that impact. But I think what I would say to conclude is, despite all this arguable rigging of the rules, all the polls are currently suggesting that the changes the Conservatives make won't help them now, in October, November, December, or even in January. If they genuinely believe in the changes they have made to our democracy, they should call a general election now.
The question is that this House has considered the conduct of elections. Minister.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr Mundell, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this morning. And I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, the member for North East Fife, for instigating this debate. The topic, as set out on the order paper, has considered the conduct of elections, was a wide canvas. We had no reference point to which, if any, specific points the Honourable Lady was going to draw the House's attention to. So these are manuscript notes based on my own knowledge as the Elections Minister. Mr Mundell, let me shoot, if I may, stone cold dead, two foxes which the Honourable Lady has tried to set running round Westminster Hall this morning. The first was, and I quote directly, that she thought that the Elections Act and subsequent guidance was, and I quote directly, a tool of the current government to improve its own position. Absolutely not. And I say gently to the Honourable Lady, she cannot then turn around in good faith and in all conscience and then say, our electorates need to have faith and confidence in the robustness and the resilience and the honesty and the transparency and the integrity of the system, and then try to say, in almost the juxtaposed breath, that the government was trying to rig the rules in its favour. If the Honourable Lady doesn't believe me, I'd ask her just to look at the evidence and the facts. Because last year's local elections, if you look at the results, what I suggest to the House demonstrate beyond peradventure that even if they had been planned to improve the position of the government, the plan didn't work. They were not results which my party welcomed. So I'm afraid her fox is not only shot, but it's buried on that point. I take her point entirely, that the public need to have faith in the system. And I'd again suggest politely to her that it is our job as parliamentarians and our colleagues in and across the local government sector to ensure that the public have that, and the opening remarks of the Honourable Lady didn't help in that important endeavour. The second fox I want to shoot and butcher is that we are in some way undermining the independence of the Electoral Commission. The Commission's independence is sacrosanct. The Chairman and the Chief Executive of the Commission know that. We work well and closely together. I made very clear that point on the floor of the House when bringing the statement forward. We have to have faith and confidence in the robust independence of the Commission, and that is a ditch that I will die in to defend. The Honourable Lady raised a number of other issues. She described almost as some sort of elections equivalent of the Russian Revolution, our revocation of the first past the post. It wasn't, Mr. Mundell, you will recall, an ancient piece of UK constitutional architecture. It was always envisaged to be a temporary piece of legislation, wisely brought in by the then coalition partners, but the Honourable Lady's party was a key and important part to provide stability and confidence to the markets and to the electorate, that having inherited the absolute horror show of a financial legacy from the Labour Party, that there was a secure and stable government that would take difficult decisions to restore the nation's finances. It was always envisaged to be temporary. It is no longer required. This is for no other reason that that act was revoked. She spoke about the boundary reforms, long overdue. If you remember, she will remember, it was before her time, it was before mine. It was a bit of horse trading between my party and hers. We had a referendum on changing the first past the vote system. My side won, her side lost, but the Liberals seem to be very poor losers on that, and rather like the SNP, who always try to resurrect, let's have an independence referendum, they keep picking away at the scab of first past the post. I'm not entirely sure the electorate are with them on that, given the results of the referendum that was held on changing the voting system. The Boundary Commission review for parliamentary seats was long overdue. We know full well that this will now take place every 8 years. The next review will be required to report by 2031 and will be based on the registers as at December 2028. It's about time we just that as part of an iterative process to ensure that as populations grow and shrink and new housing development comes on stream, that our parliamentary boundaries broadly reflect in equal number to ensure that it really is one member, one vote, and all of us are equal in this House.
On that point, Minister,
I may in a moment, because she's covered a lot of ground, and I want to give respect to the Honourable Lady by covering the very serious and sensible points that she has raised. I do want to say about voter ID. The underpinning of all of the Act and the subsequent statutory instruments which we have brought forward are to not rest on our laurels. Now, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right that in broad terms, how our elections have been conducted in this country have been robust and fair, and everybody has accepted the results, both those who have won and, more importantly, those who have lost. But I don't think we can rest on our laurels. She will know, as I do, that we're living in a changing world where Western democratic principles are under acute pressure, where the rise of populism and social media brings challenges which our forefathers had not foreseen. So I think it was absolutely purpose to have a reflection and a review and an update on the rules which govern our electoral processes in order to ensure that they are fit for purpose and demonstrably capable of being changed and reformed. On voter ID, there was a very long list of qualifying documentation. 99% of all voters have at least one form of acceptable ID, and many have more. There is, of course, the VAC, which is the voter authority, the voter certificate, which is eligible. It's free. It lasts for 3 years, and that meets the needs of that 1% of the population who don't have an acceptable form of ID. We have a list. It's quite long. They're not carved into tablets of stone. I say to her, and I hope that she will welcome this is an iterative and organic process. As technologies change, as new forms of ID come on board, then of course government will respond. We reviewed the situation post the local elections of 23. We will have to do a quick review post these coming elections in May 24, and tweaks could easily be made, if required, in preparation for the general election later this year. I think that is actually the right way to go. Turnout in 2023 for the local elections was broadly commensurate with that of previous years, and the Honourable Gentleman for Strangford, no longer in his place, referenced, I thought quite rightly, that within the boundaries of the United Kingdom, voter identification has been a very accepted part of the electoral landscape in Northern Ireland, but again with no demonstrable negative impact in turnout. The Honourable Lady and I share an absolute keenness, as does the government, as does the Electoral Commission, as does local government, in order to ensure that we maximise now our attention, which all of the survey work has pointed, to drive up registration and participation for those that we might colloquially described as hard-to-reach groups. Sometimes students, sometimes the very elderly, people from BAME communities, and also those with disabilities, particularly disabilities which make it a challenge to come into new spaces, meet and interact with new people. We are deploying, because we take this absolutely seriously, and I want to put absolutely clearly on record, we want to make sure that anybody and everybody who is eligible to vote in any electoral event has the right to do so, and if they wish to exercise that right, they must be free to do so. So deploying the strength and power of .gov.uk, working with the Commission, turbocharging the engines of local government communication, reaching out to faith groups, to disability groups, to the voluntary sector. We are Exocet-like focused on driving up registration within those communities and participation with a greater awareness with regards to voter ID. That is absolutely key, and I think it is right to do. And if the Honourable Lady and I agree possibly on nothing else in this debate, then I hope that she will welcome that. Overseas vote. She repeats a line which I had rather hoped is the third fox, Mr. Mundell, I've needed to shoot in response to the Honourable Lady's remarks. A qualifying overseas voter cannot just choose willy-nilly which constituency that they register in. Now, I appreciate sitting in the ivory tower of Marsham Street, one can sometimes be slightly devolved between theory and practice. But I've actually visited an election office in a local authority this Monday, and I actually completed some of the applications processing them. I did it all fairly, and I was supervised. 2, we admitted. 1, there wasn't sufficient because they said they'd been on the paper register. It hadn't been digitalised. Their application then is put into the pending box, and further proof of ID is then required to prove where that individual, if qualifying, where they lived in that constituency to prove that they have a right to vote there. I know some feared that this was parties would organise themselves to motivate people to apply to vote in their most marginal seats. One has to demonstrate without any form of a doubt that you had a link to that last constituency. That is important. The Honourable Lady asked what I thought the numbers may be. We assess that the potential quantum is in totality, that includes those who were already qualifying to be overseas voters under the old 15-year rule, to be round about 3 million. Of course, I could wait to the Honourable Lady.
That was not a third fox. I was not suggesting in any way that there was not be robust processes in place for people to register in a particular seat. What I was asking was the assessment of the numbers, because I think the Minister must accept that if we are making an estimate of 3 million, we can't say exactly where that 3 million will be, which will alter the overall electoral register in each of those constituencies.
Makes a good and clear point, and clearly when it came to the subsequent boundary review at a time where one would have to presume that those who had qualified would have already taken up and exercised that right, then of course those who are reviewing our parliamentary boundaries would take those numbers clearly into account. And that's the one number that will never move, because they're not going to be able to change a historical link to a constituency. The Honourable Lady mentioned devolution and different settlements. Can I just assure her, because it is a very important point, that whilst there are differentials between the nations of the United Kingdom, the 4 of us who are charged ministerially with regards to dealing with elections and all through the Northern Ireland office work very closely together in order to ensure that parity can be delivered as and when it can and when it's deemed to be desirable, but also to try to maximise the points that the Honourable Lady was talking about, namely simplicity and transparency across these islands. She mentioned about automatic voter registration. Again, it is something that all governments, any government, would keep under review. We've decided that individual registration is the best way. I think in some ways we all talk about rights. Sometimes we don't talk about responsibilities, and I actually think that individual motivation to register begins a contract between the young qualifying adult and the state in all of its manifestations by deciding to go onto the electoral register, obviously without being forced to vote. Mr Mandel, this has been a fascinating debate. We draw it to a conclusion. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for Fife North East. I just hope I have assured her on the two key charges that she levied against us. First of all, that the Commission independence is clear and without challenge, and we are in no way trying to gerrymander. We are the oldest part. The Conservative Party is the oldest political party in the world. We've always extended and widened the franchise. That is a historical tradition we intend to continue.
The question is that this House has considered the conduct of elections. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until 2:30 p.m.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.